My father was born in New York, but his parents, my grandparents, were born in Estonia, and they came here they left Estonia in the 1920s and went to the US. So we're called the Old Estonians. My grandfather got a job as a janitor, taking care of apartment houses, and that was also a very popular thing for Estonians and Finns. They were what they call superintendent, the janitor, the people who took care of the buildings, because you got a free apartment if you did that. And so they did that, and they moved a few times, but they ended up in this building on Sickle Street in northern Manhattan. And my grandmother was very thrifty, always saved her money, and so did he. And they were able to eventually buy the building. And they lived in the basement of the building. They moved there in the early 30s when my dad was born, and his sister. And then they eventually bought it in the 40s, early 40s. Their plan was always to come back to Estonia. They wanted to make a lot of money in the States and go back to Estonia and buy a farm. But then the war happened, and then in the 50s, when the DP started coming, they came to the house. They knew that this was a place where there were many Estonian families, and my grandmother told me stories of people just showing up on the doorstep. You know, they come from Germany, and mostly from Germany, and they just showed up. And so our building at the height was about 1/3 Estonian, and you know, some of the Estonians were quite prominent. And I don't remember all the names, but I know the guy the man who did the big English-Estonian dictionary, Paul Saakpak. He actually did the book sitting in his bed in his apartment. That's the story I was told. And then also Harald Raudsepp and his wife, he was the editor of Vaba Eesti Sõna for many, many years. He lived in our building. My grandmother was involved in the Eesti Haridusselts. She was one of the teachers. She taught Estonian to children. I do remember that she sent, my mother-in-law, who was her best friend, had sukruhaigus, and so she sent insulin. And it was and it actually saved her life because there was no insulin available she just lived in Saaremaa, she was an ordinary person. And so I know that she sent insulin to Estonia and got it through somehow. I didn't grow up in the States, I grew up in Europe. But in 1985 I had moved back to the States, and she offered to take all of us to the laulupidu. And that was incredible. I mean, she took 10 of us over, and we brought, everyone had 2 suitcases full of things for the relatives, and these relatives I had never met. I didn't speak any Estonian, and we met all these relatives, and we left with almost empty suitcases, of course, because all these were gifts for the relatives, and it was really incredible. I met all these people who looked like me, and people who knew how to say my name properly, and I realized it was terrible. I couldn't speak Estonian, and I felt really bad about that. By 1990, we were here for the Song Festival, and I met Tarmo Tammerk at the Estonian Independent, and also that spring I had met, or maybe that fall, I had met Marja Lauristin and Peter Vihanem, and they invited me to go teach. So I taught at the journalism department under them. And I stayed associated with the journalism department for many years, and I taught courses with Trei. And so I worked there, and then I also worked at the Estonian Independent in Tallinn. It was amazing. I mean, it was, you know, a deficitiaeg, and I remember when all the lines and the empty shops, and you know, for me I was panicked a bit because I didn't have any food, and you know, you could buy a lot of one thing and nothing of things you needed, and so it was kind of difficult. I didn't eat that well, so a lot of eggs, but it was okay. But then my relatives from Saaremaa knew that I was here. They had one of my students at the university interviewed me and put the interview on Estonian radio, and my relatives heard it, and they just showed up from Saaremaa with all this stuff, all this food for me. So it was very nice. It was very nice, and they took care of me. And I spent a lot of time with them over the years, and eventually I married their son, my relatives. Well, Anlan was my husband. We got married in 1994 in Kuressaare. Once in a while, I would break down and go buy chocolate at the Palace Hotel for hard currency. But I felt kind of guilty doing that because my Estonian friends couldn't do it. But once in a while, I just couldn't stand it. So I'd go into the basement. There was this little shop in the basement of the Palace Hotel. You know, when the rubles went away and the kron came, it was very interesting because the foreigners did not have access to the money. Eventually, you could exchange the money at the Palace Hotel. But at the very beginning, it was only the Estonians, and so it was actually kind of, people were so happy to have their own money. And I have a friend who went out and bought a new wallet, because she didn't want to put the Estonian money in a wallet that rubles had been in. I remember I was living in Mustamäe, and I got a call. I was working for Business Week at the time. And I got a call from my bureau chief in Moscow, and she said, "Lisa, something's going on. Get to work. Go into the office." And so it was early in the morning here, and so it was the only time I've ever stopped a car. I flagged a car down, and I said, I'm a journalist. Can you get me to work?" Because I was trying to go as quickly as possible. So I went to the Ayakirian Desmaya, and we weren't really sure what was going on, except that there were troops. Troops had come in overnight from Pskov, these guys in tanks. They had come in, and then also there were paratroopers on the airfield. And I remember it was very tense for a few days. I mean, we didn't quite know which way it was going to go. And then the members of parliament met, and they were holding discussions all the time. But then, as I mentioned, Tarmo was at the parliament, and he would call us back, and he says, "They're getting ready to vote. They're getting ready to vote." And they voted, and we couldn't quite believe it, and we weren't sure. It was happening. So it was happening. It took a long time, but at the same time, it happened so quickly that you just can't believe that you're actually becoming independent. And it did. It happened, and I remember there was during those 3 days there was a meeting held in Vabaduse when people were very, very nervous, and Mario Lauristin and Heinz Falk and some other people came and spoke to people trying to calm them down. And I remember I was standing in there, and you could hear a pin drop. People were so quiet and nervous, and they were just standing there still, and I remember, but Mario was trying to, give them hope and encouragement, and so it was a really very moving event. And then also the other things that I remember was the Teletorn and what was happening there, and then also what was happening at the Radio Maja, Telemaja, and how people went to go protect it. They were called to go protect it, and my friend's father went. I covered the Merenenkai massacre when the soldiers were killed on the border with Belarus. And I went there, it was in July of 1991. It was just before independence. And I was in Vilnius at the time, and it happened, and I actually was asked by Vatican radio to go out there and report on it. So I went, and I mean, the soldiers' bodies had been moved, but the bloodstains were still everywhere. And then I went to the funeral in Vilnius. So, these things were very real, and, I had friends who were involved and who were protecting the parliament in Riga. So it was just very, very tense time. Nobody really knew it could go either way, but, I think that the people honestly, I know that there's a lot of bad things said about Savisaar, but at the time he was able to talk to the Russians, the Soviets, and keep the soldiers out of the streets. I think that was really important. I remember we were sitting in the office, and somebody said, "Oh, they're going to do some cleaning up outside the EKP." So we all went down there, and we were just kind of milling around, and it was great. Well, it was done in a very Estonian way. They got the biggest trailer and crane they could get. It was a Finnish crane, and they brought it in, and they just start removing Lenin, and they hoisted him up, and then I mean, people couldn't quite believe it. It was just happening. And in fact, I think a friend of mine told me that she was very involved in the whole independence movement, and she said that these people from the Estonian Communist Party had shown up for work, and the building, I think, had been taken over by the Estonians at that point, and they were locked out. And she said that they were just standing outside the building with their briefcases, not quite sure what to do. But anyway, at the same time, there was this, shortly after, the Lenin was removed, and I remember he was hoisted up into the air, and then he was put on his back on this flatbed truck. And because of the way the Lenin was, this Lenin, his hand was like this. So when he was on his back, it was like he was waving goodbye to everybody. It was really funny. It was really, I couldn't believe it.